now, on to our very first keynote panel of Rethink Hong Kong 2022. Kickstarting today's agenda is an esteemed lineup discussing Hong Kong's ambition and action in our race towards a net zero future. Moderating our opening keynote panel is Ms. Christine Loh, Chief Development Strategist of HKUST's Institute for the Environment. Let's welcome Christine and the panelists to the stage. Special thanks to BEC, HSBC, and MTR for their support of the session. As our speakers come on stage, please note that Q&A for all panel sessions will be conducted via our official event app, CVent. You may start submitting your questions via the You may start submitting your questions via the panel page for this session from now till the end. Please take it away, Christine.
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to see everybody here today in person. And I have the great privilege of moderating this first panel with an excellent list of panel members. We have 50 minutes for this discussion. And perhaps what we can do is to follow on from what the Secretary has just mentioned to us. And I think this particular panel is meant to talk about action. So perhaps we will focus on what you think we can all be doing. What I'd like to start is to ask each one of you to maybe just spend 5 minutes each to give us your reaction to what Secretary Chair has said. And perhaps I can just make a particular point, which is, 2050 is a long way away. And our limited brain make it hard for us to think such long term. But 2035 is not so far away. And I'm sure each one of you is able to hold 2035 in your mindset. Well, one of the things that Secretary Chair reminded us is that Hong Kong actually have specific timeline and targets for 2035. So I'm just also wanting the panel to reflect on this because what we want to do is actually accelerating with action. And I'd like to hear from each one of you how you would like to make suggestions, what you know your own companies and your industry might be doing. So perhaps, Gill, I can start with you.
Thank you, Christine, delighted. And it was great to hear from Secretary Chair this morning, and it's fantastic to see and hear about Government's Climate Action Plan 2050. Clearly, there's a role we all have to play as individuals as well, which Secretary Chair alluded to in terms of getting people involved. But the corporates obviously have an enormous role to play. And at MTR, we really have a three-pronged climate change strategy. The first is to continue to be a low-carbon public transport operator. And in some ways, this is a blessing and a curse for me and the team when we're trying to talk about investing in climate change adaptation or resilience. Because the response that I often get is, aren't we part of the solution and not part of the problem? And shouldn't we therefore just focus on our core business and doing that very well? And actually in our Swedish operations, one of the initiatives under the green pillar of their ESG strategy is improving the reliability of their train services, because they know that in doing so, more people will take the train, and that in itself has environmental benefits. Now here in Hong Kong, we're already at 99.9% reliability, and so we need to continue to do that, of course, and to deliver. The other challenge I often get, and I know, Richard, you're here with your BEC hat on today, is that given that we're almost 100% electrified as a network, isn't this all down to the electricity companies, and isn't it all their problem? And of course, while they have a role to play, and they are playing that role, we have to do our bit as well. And so the second bit of our strategy is carbon reduction measures. And we kicked off in 2021 a decarbonisation study to really ask ourselves the question, can, as MTR, we get to carbon neutrality? If so, what is it going to take to get there? How long is it going to take to get there? And very importantly, how much is it going to cost? And so we analysed our existing carbon footprint. We went around the world to look at the technology, at the ways of working that other people are adapting and adopting, and asking ourselves, could they be adopted here in Hong Kong? And so I was very proud that earlier this year, our board actually committed as a result of that study to setting science-based reduction targets for 2030 for our Scope 2 emissions here in Hong Kong, Scope 1 and 2, and our Scope 3 emissions, which does include some of our international downstream operations. We've submitted our targets to the SBTi, and we're in the process at the moment of having those validated. Alongside those, and there's a reason which I'm happy to come back to as to why we went for 2030, we have set a longer-term ambition in line with the Hong Kong government of achieving neutrality by 2050. And some of the things that we're trying to do to get us towards those targets that we've set. We're focusing on energy efficiency, so replacing all of the chillers in our network. We're about 80% through that project, and that will reduce the energy consumption on chillers by 30% from a 2017 baseline. We're also looking at new technology, so things like regenerative braking. So as trains brake, they release kinetic energy, and if you can convert that back into electrical energy, you can put it back into the overhead lines so that future trains can use that energy. We can also install inverters, and I'm getting to the limit of my technical knowledge here, in our stations, which can convert that kinetic energy into low voltage AC power to be used to power station facilities. We're looking at the generation of renewable energy. So we now have solar panels on a number of our office buildings, and we're looking to expand that program onto our depots and some of our stations. And we have a target of generating a million kilowatts of renewable energy by next year. We do have some challenges there in terms of government approvals for the use of the land for the generation of power, but that's our target for next year. And we're also looking at things like the electrification of our fleet. So where we still have diesel locomotives, where we have buses and other vehicles, looking to electrify those. And we've committed to put in 200 new EV charging points across our car park network by 2025. We're also out there looking for new solutions. And so last year we worked with the Carbonless platform to try and identify new, scalable, data-driven decarbonisation solutions. And so they ran a project for us. We had 150 submissions, got down to 4 finalists. And the final actually winning one was a building energy efficiency solution that linked up a lot of the data that our buildings are already pushing out. So if you know, for example, that only 2 people have come through your entrance gates, what does that mean you should do with your lights, with your lifts, with your escalators, with your air conditioning systems? The final part of our strategy is around adaptation and resilience, and again, Secretary Chair touched on this. So the resilience of our existing network, importantly, the resilience of our network expansion. So I was recently on an insurance roadshow to place the insurance for our new expansion projects, and the biggest risk that the insurers saw was flooding during construction. And they were talking about how we normally analyse risk looking at likelihood and severity. But when you look at likelihood of extreme weather events, actually is a 1 in 100-year typhoon a meaningless statistic anymore, because we're starting to see those, it seems, kind of almost every year. So we're regularly reviewing our assets, we're investing in mitigations, we're investing in how we respond should we have an extreme weather event, and we're changing our design standards manual so that our future network will be more resilient for the future. Last point for me is how do we fund all of this? So we have a sustainable financing framework at MTR. We started off with green bonds and expanded into other forms of green financing. And we've actually raised over $30 billion since we set that up in 2016. At a more sort of micro level, we have within MTR established a new ESG investment framework. And so this is where we've put aside a dedicated budget to fund either E or S projects or E or S enhancements to other investments. And this is really trying to make sure with every investment decision we take at MTR, the environmental and social consequences of that are taken into account. And we have scorecards that look at environmental and social projects, taking into account qualitative, quantitative metrics to try and make sure that we can meet the targets we've set ourselves, including our 2030 science-based targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Richard.
Thank you, Christine. And I'm here representing the Business Environment Council, which is a member-based organization. It has around 200 members. And interestingly, despite all the crisis that we've faced with COVID, our membership is as strong as it's ever been in our 30 years history. And I think this is a tipping point that we're seeing where action and business action is really top of mind for business leaders in Hong Kong. If I was to reflect and take away one message from Secretary Chair's presentation, what he presented as a climate action plan is actually a plan. It's not an ambition, it's not a target. It had policy, it had regulatory support, it had government coordination, it had funding, and it had clear timelines and targets with specific initiatives that would achieve net zero for Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has already turned that corner and is talking about plans rather than ambitions. If we all reflect back to COP26 in the UK last year, there was a flurry of commitments made to reach net zero targets by 2050. Many businesses, I think, became part of a very strong push towards setting ambitious targets to be carbon neutral or net zero by 2050. And here we are a year later. Many businesses are starting to think, well, okay, I've made this commitment, it's still a long way away. How do I actually deliver on this? And it's that thought process of what plan do I need? What do I need to make this happen? And I think Hong Kong is perhaps ahead of the game and should be quite proud of the fact that we have a plan rather than just a vague commitment. I think Gill also touched on some interesting reflections. For many businesses, when they look at their carbon footprint, one of the big carbon sources is electricity or energy. And you could see from Secretary Chair's presentation that 65% of carbon emissions in Hong Kong come from electricity generation. We are not an economy that has a diversity of industry, and so electricity generation is perhaps the largest industrial operation that we have in Hong Kong. So it's not surprising that electricity generation is a big source of carbon emissions. If you add on to that the 18% from transport, that represents 84% of Hong Kong's carbon emissions. So solving carbon for electricity and solving it for transport gets us more than 80% of the way there. Now that may be fine, but we still have that nearly 20%, which every business contributes to, large and small. And that is really where our business leaders need to be focusing on. Every business has a role to play in achieving net zero. And net zero is a very specific target. It's not low carbon, it's not near zero, it's net zero. And that is a very precise, very specific target and does need a very well thought through plan to achieve that. So when I reflect on where we are in Hong Kong, I think it is fantastic that we do have a clear plan. I think it's fantastic that we have very strong engagement from the business sector. I think there's a lot of things that we will need to pull together, and Gill touched on financing as one. Jonathan here is representing the finance sector, but a lot of investment is going to be needed. A lot of change is going to be needed. But for the business perspective, a lot of opportunity is going to be generated as well. And we shouldn't just think of this as compliance with a net zero target. We should think about the opportunities, because all of the change in the way that we conduct our business, the way our customers think about our business and think about our products and services, all of that represents change, and that represents opportunity as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the issues is how do we convince those who are not yet convinced that there's money to be saved or money to be made? Because I think many people are still talking about this transformation. It's going to cost money. So let us come back to this point later. Jonathan.
Christine, thank you. One of the problems of sitting in this chair is that the two panelists to my left have given such complete answers to your question, finding something incremental and meaningful to say. But I wanted to come back to your first question, where I think, as I noted down, you were asking, what do we think of the Hong Kong plan? What do we think of what CW just presented, and how can we support the delivery of that and the acceleration of that? Well, I think the first thing, the plan itself, the positives, it clearly sets out targets. It sets out the ambition to get to neutrality or zero, and as Richard says, there's an important distinction there. It sets out intermediate targets, to your point, around 2035, but I think there probably need to be some even nearer targets, as again you do see when you go into the 4 main components. So it has that sort of ambition with relevant targets, ambitious targets. And then it sets out a plan of how to get there, which again, Richard and Gill have talked about. But I think what's also important is to look at the progress to date, because a plan or a commitment doesn't really mean much, or one has to assess the credibility of those plans, and a good way to assess those credibilities is by looking at the actions taken to date. And again, you can hear that particularly coming out of what Gill says in the work that MTR are doing, and Richard's obviously representing a whole broad spectrum of commercial activity in here in Hong Kong. So there is action being taken, but probably not enough, and that's what brings us to the question around how do we accelerate that? And the role, obviously, for the finance sector, we're facilitators here. Capital is critical to the transition process. We need to facilitate the good things, and we also need to make sure that we're not facilitating the unhelpful things that take us in the wrong direction. And we also need to make sure that as we do that, we are creating and preserving and enhancing the effectiveness of a robust and stable financial system. And of course, we have regulators who demand that of us. So in as much as this sort of plan assessment framework that I've sort of walked through is a way we could look at the government policy, and indeed it is the way that we look at all of our clients, we are putting all of our clients through that assessment framework. Ambition, the plan, actions taken to date, and also looking at disclosure. Disclosure is key. Unless you're willing to disclose, one gets very skeptical about whether you're really going to make progress. So we, and many financial institutions, we're doing that for all of our clients. But it's not a one-way street, because of course the regulators are doing the same on us. They're saying, HSBC, are you looking at your clients that way? Are you managing risks? How are you shifting capital? When you say that you're achieving things, how are you managing the risk that you're misrepresenting what you're doing? And this is the whole area of greenwash. So I think in the first part of the banking answer, the finance answer to your question around accelerating, is that we need to be tougher on our clients and expect faster, more rapid action from them. And then we need to be willing to support them in taking that action by bringing capital, assuming risk in that space. And we need to be tougher on saying to other clients, we expect you to transition faster, and we're not going to be able to support you. And we need to be clearer when we communicate with our clients. The reality of today, to your point about the commercial reality here, is that when you go to the markets to raise capital, unless you have a good, robust, clear sustainability strategy, plan, and story, and you communicate it clearly, you're going to find getting access to capital increasingly more difficult. So that's where the finance piece, I think, hits right up front.
Right. Well, perhaps I can ask a question of particularly Richard, since you represent BEC and you have 200 members. Do your members have shorter term targets? So for example, 2035, clearly the government wants you to have gone along a certain way. How many companies have midterm targets?
I think if you look at business, whichever aspect you look at, there is always a spectrum. There are companies that are leading, there are companies that are following in any aspect. There are some that are more innovative and some are more conservative, some are bigger, some are smaller. So when you talk about the business sector, it does need some breaking down. Definitely there are companies in Hong Kong that have set very clear, not only ambitions, but very clear plans as well. And they are reporting on those. They are generally the larger companies in Hong Kong, and they are the ones that are perhaps facing the most pressure, and pressure from stakeholders, pressure from customers. So they are perhaps ahead of the game and leading in setting targets. Now, setting targets has to be a comprehensive plan. Just to say I'll be net zero by 2050 trust me, I'll get there, is not good enough today. Jonathan has raised a very important point that for companies to raise financing, they have to show how they are transitioning. They have to have a credible plan. Customers are demanding this. I also represent CLP. The MTR is a very large customer. The MTR has come to us and said, we want to achieve net zero. How do we do it and how do we work with you on this journey? Stakeholders, investors, and environmental NGOs, stakeholders in the community are asking for more transparency and asking for more specificity around plans. Now, for big companies, I'd say Hong Kong is perhaps a little bit behind the rest of the world in terms of Europe and even North America, but is fast catching up and is moving quite quickly. Regulatory changes are coming in that are forcing that transparency and forcing that clarity around target setting. Smaller businesses will flow on and benefit from that. And I think if large companies generally lead the way, there's an opportunity then for that experience to be gained and expertise to be shared with smaller businesses. It is tough if you're a small business operating anywhere in the world today with inflation, energy, costs, dealing with COVID, that they have to be priorities, and just surviving as a business, as a small business, is tough today. But if small businesses look to gain from the learnings and the experience of larger companies and feel part of a larger organization and work together, then they have an opportunity to bring themselves up and get ahead of the game as well.
Well, perhaps I can go, I don't know if you could see Secretary Chair's last slide. I thought his last slide was very interesting because on one side there were some rather subtle words. The last slide he talked about challenges. So these are how he sees to be Hong Kong's challenges. Cost, because no doubt, panel, you can tell us, energy cost is going to go up. It's going to go up tremendously. That's why I think he called for buildings to really work very hard to save energy. Not just to buy clean power from China, because clean power from China after 2035 is likely to be much more expensive. So the more energy we're able to save in our usage, in our buildings, the lower the cost for Hong Kong. He talked about the lack of space. So we have a limit in potentials for wind farms and solar farms of any size. He talked about technology, because some of the things that we need to get to net zero, the technology is not quite all there yet. He talked about talent, and talent, I guess, throughout the economy. How do we all become knowledgeable in our companies and the industry about what to do? And then he talked about the fact that the public, how do we all behave? Are we willing to make that change? And then he talked about extremes, which I guess is the adaptation. Because if we think this summer was hot, or that we've got massive flooding in many parts of the world, what Secretary Chair has reminded us is going forward it's going to be worse. So what kind of infrastructure do we need? What kind of plans do we need? So I guess we can pick up on any of those issues. But perhaps for our audience, all the things that you said and you want to continue to do, you want to rally your peers in business to go down this path. Is there something you want to see more of from government? So there was one slide, for example, where Secretary talked about there'll be new regulations. They would like to tighten regulations, standards, and so on. That's a political process. How fast can we go in Hong Kong? But perhaps from business, what would you like government to do sooner rather than later, or go further than perhaps, because some people are saying these targets for 2035 is not ambitious enough. So, if we were going to be more ambitious, what is it that you think you want government to do? So, Gill?
Sure. So I think there's a few things. I think funding for pilots is important, and I was pleased to see news about the funding of hydrogen for buses. Certainly, I know in Germany now there is the first fully hydrogen-powered trains operating in normal commercial service. That has challenges for underground, but could we be looking into that? I think there are potentially things government could do around carbon pricing, around carbon trading platforms, to try and encourage more people to think about how to manage their emissions.
Are you saying, Gill, that you'd like to see some kind of carbon trading in Hong Kong for the Hong Kong market?
Yes, I think that would be very interesting.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think there are also specific industries where perhaps government could corral the industry to do a bit more. Kevin will know this as well as I do, but the construction industry here is a huge challenge. Even understanding the embodied carbon that is emitted as a result of your construction activities, thinking about green and low carbon designs that may include, for example, zero carbon steel, zero carbon concrete, needs to get the regulators on board. So I think potentially government can play that sort of corralling role in some of our core industries. We looked at the stats around the amount of electricity emissions that are connected to buildings. I think also on the adaptation and resilience side, there's perhaps a little more that government could do. We've been dipping our toes in the water, I'd say, at MTR on scenario analysis at the minute, and kind of the need for that consistent set of data that companies could use to do their planning on from a scenario analysis basis. And the need for really, when it comes to extreme weather, a citywide approach, because it's fine for MTR to do all it can to think, it's made sure its facilities are flood resistant, but if the neighbouring facilities are not, then that doesn't help. So I think, again, there's a role government can play there to force some of these issues to be looked at on a citywide basis.
Right. Jonathan?
Well, I think CW set out very clearly the policies that are being implemented across the sort of the four key legs of the plan, and one of course could go through them line by line and say, well, this could be a bit more aggressive and that could be a bit more aggressive, and as Gill has done, I mean, I would agree with all of the comments Gill made. I think building regs is another area. Carbon markets is complex because we are a relatively small economy. We probably, to make that of scale, will need to work with the Greater Bay Area or beyond. But there is work going on there, and the exchange, of course, is working very hard to come forward with a proposal as to how that can be taken forward. I mean, there is a hesitation I have with questions like that, of sort of giving a list of things for other people to do, because I think, as Gill said in her first comment, the real solutions here are if we all look at what we're doing and we take the actions that we can take, then that's actually, I think, how we're going to drive the solutions here. Obviously, as I said in my first comment, we are challenging our clients on this. We do as well spend a lot of time supporting industry associations and working with regulators around financial sector policy that will support. I think we can see learnings coming out of Europe around how the European Banking Authority is now. Actually, it's the European Parliament, it's the political vehicles in Europe now pushing forward aggressively on sort of differential capital weightings for non-green and green investments. I think that's an area that Hong Kong should look to move to, perhaps follow suit very, 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 very quickly. But again, I think when it comes to an individual institution's efforts, it really should be contributing to those, but I think focus on getting your home, sorting your home story out as the priority. So we look at.
Can I just press you here, though? The issues, for example, buildings, right? I think we're all agreed that building energy efficiency is really, really important. But if Hong Kong does not dramatically tighten our building and energy codes, we will not get there. So I don't think it's just a matter of us doing our bit. There are some bits where you have to work together with government to raise the standards. So my question is, so for example, Richard, all the major property companies are members of BEC. Can we foresee a possibility where these companies will come together and say to government, we want you to raise the standards so we can actually perform at a higher level, rather than government expects us to do it voluntarily, because that's not setting a new baseline for the whole industry. Do you think that sort of thing is possible?
It is already happening, Christine, and what we are seeing with climate change is change that affects every aspect of our society. It's not just a matter of building new infrastructure. It's using different energy sources, using different fuels. If you look at hydrogen, for example, a whole regulatory system needs to be put in place to regulate hydrogen. And a lot of change is going to be needed, and government will have to work with industry and with businesses in order to make sure that that regulatory arrangement is put in place in a timely fashion. It's all very well to talk, to talk about pilot schemes, but very quickly those pilot schemes turn into a real business proposition or a change that needs to be scaled up, and that's the point where if you're then starting to talk about regulation, it's too late. So if I was to answer your question, Christine, what would be the one thing I would like government to do, it would be to work together and act with a sense of urgency to deal with climate change and the climate action plan. I feel that Hong Kong manages crises well when government all comes together and all acts with a sense of urgency, and things can get done very, very quickly here. And I feel that with climate change, we haven't yet got that sense of urgency, and I think that is the one thing that I would really say the government needs at this stage.
Gill.
Christine, can I just come in on that? I think I love the idea of kind of the businesses going to government to say, please tighten the regs, but I think Hong Kong has historically been pretty anti-regulation as a city, and I think a lot of that comes down to the SMEs. So I think what it's going to take is a few of the larger businesses that are interested in this subject, that have made these commitments to get together and to push government, but also come up with a way where we can all work with our SME supply chain and business partners to ensure that they're brought along as part of the journey.
Do you think there is any possibility of business, and all of you are in fact well known to government, to actually come together to suggest, not to Secretary Che, but to the Financial Secretary, because he holds the portfolio of the well-being of the whole economy, to actually be a facilitator or to endorse some kind of collaborative platform so we can arrive at this urgency, the understanding of working with government to set standards and plans together, so that in the next couple of years, there's a much clearer roadmap for government, including the kind of regulations that will have to be put in place. Jonathan, any comment?
Christian, look, I think as Richard said, that happens. Does it happen often enough? Are the channels of communication sufficiently effective? Clearly not, because progress is not what we would wish to see, not as rapid as we would wish to see. So absolutely, we should look to ways we can sort of reinforce that collaboration between private and public sector, if you like. But there has to be a determination on both sides, and I think that determination really arises from, on the private sector side, back to your earlier question, a recognition that this is actually good for business. And creating this facilitating regulation is actually going to drive better, more robust, more resilient, more inclusive business. So that's why I wanted to put the focus on the business component being the message that the private sector, I think, can really bring very forcefully into that discussion.
And I have a number of questions here that are related to this, which is the sustainability versus profitability. I mean, today, all of you come from a very practical business world. I think there are many people out there who are still asking, how can they justify the business case? Or their CFO is asking that, or their board members are raising this as a problem. What do you think are some steps that could be taken? Albeit the banks, some of the major banks are going to their customers and say, well, I want you to be more green. But let's be honest about it. There's a lot of money still in the economy all over the world that is not going into green things. And frankly, not all of those things are bad either, but nevertheless, if we were to accelerate into action, what should we be telling CFOs and board members? Maybe Jonathan, how are you persuading them?
I mean, I don't want to pick up on your language, Christine, but the we would love you to be green is very much, is not the message we're delivering.
Yes, that's right.
You need to be. And if you're not, you're going to find it increasingly difficult to obtain capital from us and from the markets generally. I think that's the message. Supporting by making the expectations as clear as we can, supporting by understanding how the leaders are actually looking to implement the transition and making sure that we are bringing capital and the risk capital to be able to support that. So that's why we have numerous initiatives around green tech venture space. We have a sustainable infrastructure platform we've just launched in Singapore, which is focused on moving down the credit curve towards marginally bankable projects. We're backing initiatives such as the Breakthrough Energy Venture, the Bill Gates initiative, which is looking at developing some of those breakthrough technologies, but also looking how those can be scaled here in Asia. Those, I think, are the messages that we should be, and I'm not saying we're doing it perfectly right now, but we should be delivering very clearly to our corporate partners to assist them.
Well, we have a number of questions here, and I know we have about 9 minutes left. I don't think we can leave this panel without talking about the region, without talking about the mainland. Because if we're talking about clean electricity, it can only come from the mainland. So obviously, the arrangements that the power companies, the government have to work towards getting clean power is really, really important. Also, many Hong Kong businesses actually do production on the mainland. And again, clean production on the mainland is also really important. So, maybe a perspective from all of you about regional collaboration and how you see the mainland as also, is it a driver for Hong Kong? Because one of the things that is missing today is that mainland component. Whereas if we look at China's own policy going forward on climate change, it is strong and consistent. So what is it that we can ride on in Hong Kong from that? Richard, would you like to have a go?
Thanks, Christine. Yes, I've always felt that regional cooperation is absolutely crucial to Hong Kong achieving its energy policy objectives as well as its climate policy objectives. The challenges that you cited from CW's presentation around the lack of space in Hong Kong, the size of Hong Kong, just the geography of Hong Kong means that we have limited opportunities. If you look at wind power, we are right on the tropics here. And if you go back in history when sailing ships were traveling the world, these were called the doldrums, where there was very little wind. So we need to recognize that Hong Kong can't change its geography. It is where it is. And the opportunities that we have for renewable energy will be somewhat limited. So an ambition of 7.5%, perhaps up to 15%, can only be realized if we think more broadly about our geography and not confine ourselves to the boundary of Hong Kong. We are connected so much in so many aspects of our society with the mainland, whether that's through financial institutions, our electricity suppliers connected, our railway systems are connected, and that connection is increasing. So that represents opportunities for us. And we can improve, and we can lower the cost, and we can become more efficient and more rapid, more effective in achieving a climate target if we think more broadly and not just limit ourselves to the confines of Hong Kong. So I think thinking regionally is absolutely crucial for us.
I mean, there's obviously thinking regionally, there's a public sector, government-to-govern component, and then there's a private sector component. What do you think the private sector can do? I mean, obviously, a private sector can invest in energy on the mainland and invest in circular production on the mainland, but I'm just thinking, what are some of the things that you are doing or your members are doing or people are investing in that will benefit the entire region? Because there's quite a number of questions, people interested in the regional dimension. Gill?
So I think, and I was surprised slightly that Secretary Chair put it up as a challenge, was this question of technological breakthrough. And I think there has to be an opportunity, particularly here with Shenzhen just over the border, for us to really be looking at investing in technological solutions to decarbonisation. We've seen that through some of the platforms that we've worked with, that a lot of the good ideas are coming out of the mainland. And so I think there must be an opportunity there for private sectors to be looking for those investment opportunities, or for startups, academic institutions to work with to try and help them on their own decarbonisation journeys.
Yeah, I think it's a long list, Christine, isn't it? I mean, as Gill said, there's China, and particularly the Greater Bay Area has a great technology offering that Hong Kong can facilitate to get that, mobilize that in its regional and global applications. So the technology, I think, will flow both ways, and Hong Kong is in a great position to facilitate both flows. I mean, we obviously, as a bank, we have a big client base in China, Greater Bay Area and beyond. We're looking to, bring to that market, support corporates there with the sort of, we talked about sort of the risk analysis, transition planning approach. That's something we're looking to bring into our clients globally, so China and everywhere. Of course, we are facilitating via Hong Kong the financial flows, and again, it's the two-directional flow. Initiatives such as the Common Ground Taxonomy can be important initiatives to facilitate and make those two-way flows more efficient. So, Hong Kong has a huge role to your question.
Mm-hmm. Well, we only have 4 minutes left. So whilst I'm going to remind the audience that there are many other issues on SMEs, on Scope 3 emissions and so on, biodiversity, that will have discussion throughout the day here, I think this might be the panel where we only have time to ask this question, which is the world is in a huge turn right now on inflation, on war in Europe, on energy. These are all things that will have tremendous impact on businesses. From one comment from each one of you, do you see that any of these things that are happening like right now might slow us down or might slow you down in your journey towards sustainability? Where are the risks? Maybe I could start with you, Gill.
Sure. So my CFO and I have a regular, robust debate, I should say, around these kind of topics. And some of the press recently, the article in the Economist around, ESG is dead, don't necessarily help. But we've still got to find a way to sell the business case for investing in decarbonisation. If you can show a hard business case, that's fantastic. Can you prove that your energy bills will go down? Can you invest in new startups, new technologies? But you've also got to think about selling to the heads and the hearts, and the pressure that we see from our investors, from the regulators, from NGOs, from our staff even, really helps me kind of continue to drive this agenda within MTR. I think the biggest one moment that really helped me was when our CEO and our FD met one of our largest active investors, and the first question he asked them, what are your carbon emissions?
Okay, good. A quick comment from you, and then a closing comment from Richard. Jonathan.
So, Kristen, I think one observation, obviously, is that rising energy prices immediately creates a higher return on energy efficiency investment. So, in that sense, it's a stimulus to more efficient resource management. But of course, the wider economic challenges of which the energy situation is part are a drain on resources, and as you say, investment is required. So there clearly is some short-term volatility, perhaps some interruption in the progress towards a more sustainable system. Certainly our views as an institution, and this is reinforced by a survey we did recently in respect of war in Europe, the Ukraine-Russia situation. When we surveyed, and these are sort of anecdotal numbers, it's not professional research, but I think 45% said it will slow down the transition, which means obviously 55% are saying they don't think it'll slow down, so very mixed opinions there. But when you look at that over time, you see it's very clearly messaged. It's short-term disruption, but longer term it's actually reinforcing the drivers to develop a more robust, resilient, affordable energy system is actually going to distributed energy via renewables. So perhaps there are some long-term positives that we shouldn't lose sight of here.
Richard, a final comment from you.
I think it's important to realize climate change is not going away. That pressure is coming because of the lack of time that we have. 2050 is less than 30 years away, and each year that goes by, it gets closer and closer. So the sense of urgency is building around climate change. The shorter term crises that we see, and nobody could have predicted the COVID pandemic or the conflict in the Ukraine and the impact that's had, but those are relatively short-term crises. They can be managed through in the short term. If you lose sight of that long-term urgency with climate change, then you will just waste time that will never be recovered. And I think the pressure on climate change and climate action is building and accelerating. So this is not something that we can afford to lose sight of. And despite all the crises, we just have to manage out the best we can, but keep the ball rolling and keep things moving.
Well, thank you very much, and please join me to thank the excellent panel.
Thank you very much, Christine, Richard, Jonathan, and Gill, for that very insightful panel. Yeah. We'll now take a quick break, but please be back here at 11 a.m. as we continue the Sustainable Transformation Dialogue with a focus on addressing Scope 3 emissions through engagement and empowerment. Meanwhile, all the other concurrent programs are about to commence in our other 6 theatres and stages. Do plan ahead and make sure you don't miss any of the sessions of interest happening in the other venues. See you at 11 o'clock.